Today, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to be a leader in about 10 minutes. Not really. In all seriousness, I am going to be teaching you Chapter 1 of the Learn to Lead series. This is leadership theory published by the Civil Air Patrol. So if you are a Civil Air Patrol cadet, this will help you with your first promotion. This is a crash course series, so you are going to get 30 pages of textbook material from the Learn to Lead series Chapter 1 in less than 10 minutes. So that means that I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I will cover all of the important topics that you will have to look into again. So you'll get a wide snapshot of all of it, and then you'll go in and be a little bit more interested when you look through the textbook. So throughout this process, feel free to pause the video, screenshot, look through the material that I have for you. There are some stories in here, there's some things that you'll have to memorize, but ultimately when you go through this video, I hope that you'll have a broad understanding of what you need to learn to be able to pass your first promotion in Civil Air Patrol. So let's get started. The Air Force defines leadership as the art and science of influencing and directing people to accomplish the assigned mission. The three components of most definitions of leadership will have the leader, the follower, and the mission. These are three terms you'll have to remember throughout our time in leadership theory. These are some things that we're going to keep in mind when talking about leadership. The assumptions on leadership is that you don't have to be a commander to lead. Some of the best stories in leadership came from followers and people that didn't have a title. That doesn't mean that commanders shouldn't be leaders. All commanders are expected to be good leaders. That doesn't always happen, but that's what we're trying to change. The second assumption is leaders are made, not born. We'll get to support this assumption throughout our time in leadership theory, but one of the most important things about this is that you're going to have some experience to be a leader. You're going to practice it. It's an art and a science. Fourth, leaders are not bullies. Leaders don't direct people around and point fingers everywhere. Leaders are more of a mentor, their supporting role, and a lot of good leaders are servant leaders. They lead from the bottom and they support their people to be better than they were when they started. The last one is that leadership is moral. Now this can be debated in a bunch of different ways, mostly with the argument that, was Adolf Hitler a leader? A lot of people will say he was a leader of people and that makes him a leader, but for the context of this book and the way that the Learn to Lead textbook likes to do it, we like to understand that good leadership is what we want to talk about and what we want to emulate. The example that the Civil Air Patrol and Learn to Lead textbook gives here is with President Truman and General MacArthur. MacArthur was known as a very powerful five-star general, and when he started to overstep his bounds with the president ended up firing him. Although it didn't make sense to a lot of people as why he was fired, the leadership lesson here is that everybody is accountable in leadership, even a five-star general. Now we're going to be talking about leaders in different capacities. We'll have a leadership case history on each of those, and I'm excited to get to show them to you. First one we'll go through is leader as a visionary. This is General Billy Mitchell. He had an idea of what the Air Force was going to be like before it was created. Nobody really believed him, and he was even fired for his position for his beliefs. The quote here is 17 years before Pearl Harbor, Billy Mitchell was warning that Japan could use carrier-based airplanes to attack Pearl Harbor, and no one listened. This is entirely true, but Billy Mitchell was very adamant about it and was one of the very first advocates for an Air Force before it was created. The cautionary tale that Civil Air Patrol gives here is that visionaries must also live in the real world. So for instance, if you think that you should change something about the Civil Air Patrol cadet program and say, well, maybe we should be able to use nukes and bombs, and I think that I'm being a visionary for Civil Air Patrol, it's not feasible that Civil Air Patrol volunteers are going to be able to hold nuclear weapons. So even though that's your idea, you'd have to take a step back and realize that we're living in the real world, so that might not be able to happen. The second person we get to talk to is President Kennedy as his leader, as a motivator. The example that Civil Air Patrol uses here is his speech at Rice University in Texas on going to the moon. And he uses a bunch of different forms of motivation to try and encourage people and tell them that we are in fact going to the moon. And he talks about this in a commencement address at Rice University. The book also talks about different types of motivation that we do not use as leaders, such as threats, coercion, and extortion. These are not tools that genuine good leaders of moral character use. The 5 forms of motivation that are typically used from leaders and in teams are money, praise, positions, awards, and special privilege. Many of you know this face. This is Martin Luther King Jr., and we are using him as an example for our leader as a communicator. He was an incredible speechwriter, as many of you would know from the I Have a Dream speech. His ability to make complex ideas easy to understand is one of the roles of the leader as a communicator, is that it really makes big issues such as civil rights into something that's tangible for the people. It gets them motivated and it gets them to follow a mission. Communication is super important in being a leader. The cautionary note that we have here is that leaders are seen by their conduct, not just by their words. So if you give a really good speech but don't have integrity and don't lead your people correctly, people are going to notice. Our leader as an expert example is Jimmy Doolittle. So he was known for a long time as someone with a lot of technical experience. That allowed his followers to really trust that he knew what he was talking about and follow him correctly. He ended up leading the Doolittle raids on his recommendation because of that technical experience, and a lot of people can build that technical experience to gain followers. The cautionary note that we have here is something called the Peter Principle. That's something that you'll have to remember too. A leadership theory principle called the Peter Principle is where people start to promote others based solely on technical experience, and that's not actually a good thing. So the quote here is, people will rise to the level of their own incompetence. So if I was really good at building Legos and then you promoted me to be the manager of a Lego company, I'd no longer be building Legos, I'd instead be leading people, and I might not be very good at that. So that's called the Peter Principle. The leader as a teacher example is with Anne Sullivan. Hopefully you know Anne Sullivan was the teacher that got Helen Keller, the deaf and blind child, to be able to communicate and speak and become an active member of society. Leaders teach their teams how to act and what to value. So leaders as teachers are super important because it completely changes the perspectives of your followers. The first leadership theory to memorize is called the Great Man Theory. The Great Man Theory creates people who study leadership and focus on the life stories of successful people. Sometimes, though, this is something that we don't really agree with because the Great Man Theory only focuses on the positive qualities of these people. It claims that leaders are born as perfect little angels and that they don't make mistakes and then they lead people perfectly, which in reality we know that that's not true. Air Force doctrine believes that leadership is built from experience, education, and training, so that means that they can't be born, they have to be made. Hero worship is another problem with the Great Man Theory because it makes us forget that people have failures. The example of this is with Winston Churchill. When Churchill was young, he talked about being a big, powerful world leader. In fact, there's a quote from him when he was 16 claiming that he was going to do all the things that he ended up doing. Now we can look at him and see that he did end up doing those things, but there were failures in the process. Trait theory is a part very similar to Great Man Theory. Trait theory distinguishes leadership qualities that create good leaders, and there's a list of qualities that philosophers try to develop to try and pinpoint the things that people will have to do to become good leaders. And it can be a good tool. Trait theory, when you look into it, you can see different qualities that people have to be good leaders, and those are definitely good things to emulate. However, it's unfounded and it's not a good theory because each leader is unique. Each leader has a different way of leading and different traits that make them into a good or bad leader. So no one could really agree on these traits and which ones were more important, so that makes trait theory unfounded. The other problem with this is prejudice. Having prejudice makes it difficult to make a definitive list, because if somebody's prejudiced against a certain kind of people, they might say that that makes them a bad leader, but in reality somebody has a completely different view. If you would like to pause, the book also does ask you in the chapter to try and pick five or six that you agree with and then see how you fit those traits, but maybe even find some that you don't agree with or that you don't think fit your leadership style. The golden mean and the philosopher Aristotle's realization was that people can have too much of a good thing. So in leadership, if I were to just pick one on this list, if I was too compassionate and I wasn't able to make rational decisions, that might make me a bad leader. Or if I was too generous and I wasn't able to take care of myself, if I was too generous with my time, that would also make me a bad leader. But compassionate and generous people also make good leaders, so it's kind of confusing. Lastly, we are going to talk about the American flag for your test on Leadership Chapter 2. You will have to know some things about the American flag, but the American flag was created on June 14th, 1777. Flag Day is on June 14th, so you'll remember that. The current flag was introduced in 1960 after Hawaii became the 50th state. This is a picture from the American History Museum in Washington, D.C. I actually got the privilege to see this when I went to Civic Leadership Academy, National Cadet Special Activity in the Civil Air Patrol. That is the original flag that flew at Fort McHenry in 1814, where Francis Scott Key saw it and started to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So this is where the Star-Spangled Banner was written, and that is in fact the original Star-Spangled Banner. In this chapter, we've explained how the Air Force defines leadership, but we've also encountered a lot of other perspectives on it. Likewise, we found that a leader is called upon to play several roles. It would be super challenging to write a complete description of the job of the leader. The responsibilities are super varied and difficult to explain. And through our study of the great man theory and trait theory, more questions were really raised than answered, right? Like, we have a lot of different perspectives on what leadership can be. So leadership really remains elusive. It's not easily pinned down or explained, but simply by discovering how mysterious leadership can be, that it requires deep study and reflection, you've taken an important step in your development as a leader.